Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I am a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be discussing the RIP routing JWeb Learning Byte. In the topology on the slide, we have two vSRX devices, vSRX1 and vSRX2. vSRX1 is connected to user and the internet. vSRX1 is also connected to vSRX2 over the GIGI003 interface. Then vSRX2 is connected to the DMZ server. So in this example, we want to configure RIP routing on vSRX1 using JWeb. vSRX2 has already been configured with RIP, so there's no need to worry about configuring things on vSRX2, but we will need to configure RIP using JWeb on vSRX1. Okay, so we have some criteria that's listed on the slide. We want to ensure that the user can communicate with the DMZ server and hosts on the internet. Then we need to ensure that the user can SSH to the loopback address for vSRX2. And we also want to ensure that the DMZ server can communicate with hosts on the internet, as well as open SSH sessions to the loopback address for vSRX1. So with that, let's get started and jump to the JWeb interface for vSRX1. All right, so here is the JWeb interface for vSRX1, and we are currently in the configure device settings, basic settings, workspace, but we need to jump to the network, routing, and RIP workspace. Okay, here you can see there's no configuration for RIP, and so we need to click the create button to begin creating a new RIP group. Okay, so here is the general tab for a new RIP group. We need to specify the RIP instance name, and this is just going to be the group name. We're going to call this RIP-LB, LB for Learning Bytes, and all the other parameters have their default, so there's no need to configure them unless you really need to configure them for some reason. And then next, let's click on the neighbor tab. We need to select one of these interfaces to be a neighbor. And if you recall from the topology, GIGI003 was the interface that connected to vSRX2 from vSRX1. So let's go ahead and select that interface. And when we select an interface here, we can edit the interface and make changes if necessary. We can set an import policy, for example, if we want to block certain routes. And we can also adjust the send and receive information or parameters and things like that. So let's go ahead and click OK. And then let's click OK again. One other quick thing that I want to point out is we do kind of need to specify a policy here. We don't have any policies to specify though. We haven't configured any routing policies. And so we're going to have to go back and make some changes after we configure RIP, which is fine. That's not a huge deal. And so we have the neighbor set up. That's great. We have some general information such as the RIP instance name. That's fine. Let's go ahead and click OK. Go ahead and commit the configuration. And so let's go ahead and create some routing policies. So we click policies, click new, and let's call this policy, we'll just call this RIP-EXP for export all the way. And then uncheck test policy, and then we need to add some terms. So we'll add this, we'll call this term static. We do need to redistribute a static route. We have a default static route on vSRX1, so hosts can reach the internet. However, we need to redistribute that into RIP, so then the DMZ server can access the internet. So we need to do that. So that's the first one we need to create. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say from protocol, we'll select static, click OK. Action, we'll select accept. Let's add a second term. We'll call this direct, because we need to redistribute our direct routes. Because if we're going to have the user communicate with the DMZ server needs to know how to get to the user. So we'll call this term direct. We'll say protocol direct action accept. And we'll click OK and click OK again. And let's jump back to RIP. And let's edit this. So selected the RIP instance, RIP-LB. I'm going to edit it. And we're going to select policy. We're going to hit the plus sign next to export policy. And we're going to select RIP export. And click OK. And let's commit the configuration again. All right, so we should have RIP functioning. We should have some neighbors, or at least one neighbor, I guess. And so let's go ahead and go to the monitor workspace. All right, so here's the monitor workspace. We need to go to routing. Let's go to RIP information. And here we can see the different RIP information. And we can see that we have some RIP neighbors, or at least one RIP neighbor. It's in the upstate. Great. We see things are working great there. We can see we're using RIP version 2. We can see the port number, hold down time, global routes that are learned. There's 5. So, okay, that's great. We're actually getting some information. Perfect. So let's go ahead and click on this RIP neighbor, click details, and we're able to see additional details like updates sent, how many in the last 5 minutes, last minute. And we can scroll down and see other things like RIP2 updates received. We have 10, 8 in the last 5 minutes, 2 in the last minute. So yeah, we can see the different information. We can see how many routes are learned, route timeout, routes advertised, and the update info as well. So let's go to the route information workspace. This is going to show the route table. And in here, we can see that we have INET 0 selected. We could select INET 6.0 as well, but those are the only 2 route tables we currently have configured. We are dealing with IPv4, so INET.0 is what we want to see. And we can select or place RIP in the protocol field and search, and we can see all the RIP routes. And this is what we want to see. We want to see that we are receiving RIP routes and the state of those routes. And you can see that we do have RIP routes for the DMZ server network, for the loopback address for vSRX2. So that's looking pretty good. So we are receiving those routes that we need to be receiving. And although we don't have time to check it out, we could log into vSRX2 and see the routes that we are receiving from vSRX1. Simply testing communication will let us know how well those routes are being passed. So let's go ahead and jump to the router that I have set up that is split into multiple virtual routers to test that communication. So here is the router that is split up into multiple virtual routers. And so we will begin by pinging an internet host from the user. And that looks great. We're able to ping the internet host, or an internet host rather, from the user. Let's ping it from the DMZ. Again, that looks great. We are pinging from the DMZ. That's exactly what we want to see. We're pinging an internet host from that DMZ routing instance. Okay, then we want to make sure that we can SSH to vSRX2 loopback address from the user. That looks good. Yep, that's vSRX2. Great. And then we need to SSH to the vSRX1 loopback address from the DMZ. Great. Everything works as expected. So that brings us to the end of this Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we discussed how to configure RIP using JWeb, and then we also demonstrated how to verify RIP routing using JWeb. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Networks Certification Program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.